Welcome to Miss Scarlett. Subscribe and don't miss out on Patreon. Have fun!
Caden gave a yawn as he inserted the battered key, more a habit than a necessity, into the ignition. The familiar vibrations of the truck's engine welcomed him like an old companion as he prepared for another ride. He maneuvered his substantial vehicle out of the truck stop, where many similar beasts rested after their journeys. With another long drive ahead, Caden's thoughts drifted to the unique parcel he'd impulsively bought during his last break, escaping the mundane routine of the road. A thrilling purchase, it resided patiently in its cardboard home, awaiting his return. Glancing momentarily at his worn reflection in the mirror, he felt a peculiar disconnect from the well-traveled man staring back at him. As Caden guided his rig onto the road, destination set, the anticipation of what waited for him made each rotation of the wheels a little easier. The unremarkable brown box promised an adventure, a contrast to his everyday life, and it was drawing nearer. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the sun had long since set. Caden's hands trembled slightly as he unlocked the front door, knowing what awaited him inside. There it was, sitting innocently on the kitchen counter. Just a plain cardboard box, but to Caden, it might as well have been Pandora's box. He approached it slowly, as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. With a deep breath, he picked up a pair of scissors and carefully cut through the tape. The cardboard flaps fell open, revealing a mass of black fabric nestled in tissue paper. Caden's breath caught in his throat as he lifted it out. The corset was beautiful, sleek black satin with delicate boning visible beneath the fabric. It felt both substantial and impossibly delicate in his hands. Caden ran his fingers over the material, marveling at its smoothness. For a long moment, he simply stood there, holding the corset and staring at it. Then, almost without conscious thought, he began to undress. His flannel shirt hit the floor, followed by his undershirt. Caden hesitated for a moment before removing his jeans as well, leaving him standing in just his boxers. He held the corset up to his torso, trying to figure out how it was supposed to go on. The laces in the back intimidated him. How was he supposed to tighten them himself? After a few fumbling attempts, he managed to wrap it around himself and fasten the front clasps. Now came the tricky part. Caden reached behind himself, grasping at the laces. It was awkward and uncomfortable, but he managed to grab hold and start pulling. The first tug took his breath away, literally. He gasped as the corset began to constrict around his midsection. Determined, Caden continued pulling, tightening the laces bit by bit. It was a struggle, and more than once he wondered if he was doing it wrong. But slowly, he felt the corset molding to his body, creating curves where there had only been straight lines before. Finally, when he could tighten it no further, Caden tied off the laces with shaking hands. He stood there for a moment, just breathing. It felt strange, restrictive, yet oddly comforting at the same time, like a firm hug that never ended. Slowly, almost afraid of what he might see, Caden turned to face the full-length mirror on his closet door. The sight that greeted him made his knees go weak. The person staring back at him was different. The corset nipped in his waist, creating an hourglass silhouette he'd never possessed before. It smoothed out the slight paunch of his stomach, lifting and shaping his chest in a way that was unmistakably feminine. Caden's hand flew to his mouth, stifling a gasp. He turned to the side, then back again, drinking in the sight of this new version of himself. A thrill shot through him, unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It was as if he was seeing himself clearly for the first time. In that moment, something shifted inside Caden. A door that had been locked tight for years creaked open, just a crack. He reached out, touching his reflection in the mirror with trembling fingers.
"Hello,"
he whispered, voice barely audible.
"It's nice to meet you."
The next morning, Caden woke feeling sore but strangely energized. The corset lay where he'd carefully placed it the night before, folded neatly on top of his dresser. He'd been reluctant to take it off, but knew he couldn't sleep in it. As he went about his morning routine, Caden found his thoughts constantly drifting back to the corset and how he'd felt wearing it. It was like an itch he couldn't scratch, a craving he couldn't satisfy. He had 3 days before his next haul. 3 days to explore this new side of himself that had been unlocked. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. After a quick breakfast, Caden found himself drawn back to the corset. This time, he took more care in putting it on, making sure the laces were even, and taking his time to adjust it properly. It was still a challenge, but not quite as daunting as the night before. Once it was on, Caden stood in front of the mirror again, admiring the way it shaped his body. But something was missing. He frowned, trying to put his finger on what it was. Then it hit him. The rest of his outfit. He was still wearing his usual jeans and t-shirt, which clashed horribly with the elegant corset. Caden bit his lip, considering. He didn't own any women's clothing. Or did he? With a sudden burst of inspiration, Caden hurried to his closet. Buried in the back, behind piles of flannel shirts and worn jeans, was a garment bag he'd almost forgotten about. It contained a suit he'd worn to his cousin's wedding years ago. A suit that had been just a touch too small even then. Caden pulled out the crisp white dress shirt and black slacks. They weren't women's clothes, but they were more formal than his usual attire. He slipped on the shirt, leaving it unbuttoned over the corset, and stepped into the slacks. The effect was interesting. The slacks were snug, accentuating the curve of his hips created by the corset. The open shirt framed the corset beautifully, creating an androgynous look that made Caden's heart race. He stared at his reflection, barely recognizing himself. Gone was the burly truck driver. In his place stood someone softer, more refined. Caden ran a hand through his short black hair, wondering how it would look if he grew it out. The rest of the day passed in a blur of experimentation. Caden tried on every combination of clothing he could think of, mixing and matching pieces he'd never considered putting together before. He even dug out an old eyeliner pencil his ex-girlfriend had left behind, attempting to apply it with shaky hands. By the time evening rolled around, Caden's bedroom looked like a tornado had hit it. Clothes were strewn everywhere, and he'd somehow managed to get eyeliner smudged on his pillowcase. But he felt more alive than he had in years. As he stood in front of the mirror, wearing the corset under a soft sweater he'd forgotten he owned, Caden made a decision. He couldn't keep this confined to his house. He needed to take this new self out into the world, even if it was just for a little while. Heart pounding, Caden grabbed his keys and headed for the door. He paused with his hand on the doorknob, suddenly doubting himself. What if someone recognized him? What if they laughed or, worse, got angry? But the pull was too strong to resist. Caden took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and stepped out into the night. The cool evening air hit him like a shock, making him even more aware of the corset beneath his clothes. Caden walked quickly to his car, glancing around nervously, half expecting to see neighbors peering out their windows at him. But the street was quiet, most houses dark. Caden slipped into the driver's seat, wincing slightly as the corset dug into his ribs. He'd have to learn how to sit comfortably in this thing. He drove aimlessly for a while, no real destination in mind. Just being out of the house, dressed as he was, felt like a huge accomplishment. Eventually, he found himself pulling into the parking lot of a small diner on the outskirts of town. Caden sat in the car for a long moment, gathering his courage. The diner's windows glowed warmly, and he could see a few patrons inside. It wasn't busy, just a couple of truckers having coffee and a family finishing up their meal.
You can do this,
Caden muttered to himself.
Just go in, have a cup of coffee, and leave. No big deal.
Taking another deep breath, he got out of the car and walked towards the diner's entrance. Each step felt monumental, like he was walking on the moon instead of across a parking lot. The bell above the door jingled as Caden entered. He felt every eye in the place turn towards him, though in reality, only the waitress behind the counter glanced up.
Sit anywhere you like, hun,
she called out, already reaching for a menu. Caden nodded, not trusting his voice, and slid into a booth near the back. He picked up the laminated menu with trembling hands, pretending to study it intently. The waitress appeared at his table, coffee pot in hand. What can I get for you this evening? Caden cleared his throat. Just coffee, please, he managed, his voice coming out higher than usual. If the waitress noticed anything unusual, she didn't show it. She simply poured his coffee and left him with a friendly smile. As Caden sipped his coffee, he gradually began to relax. No one was staring at him. No one was pointing or whispering. He was just another customer having a late-night cup of coffee. The realization was liberating. For the first time, Caden allowed himself to truly enjoy the feeling of being out in public, dressed as he was. The corset beneath his sweater reminded him with every breath that he was doing something daring, something true to himself. He ended up staying at the diner for over an hour, nursing his coffee and people-watching. When he finally left, he felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't experienced in years. The drive home was filled with a giddy excitement. Caden couldn't stop smiling, replaying the evening in his mind. It might have seemed like a small thing to anyone else, just going out for coffee, but to him, it felt like he'd climbed Everest. As he pulled into his driveway, Caden made another decision. This couldn't be a one-time thing. He needed to explore this side of himself further, to see where it might lead. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of online shopping and research. Caden ordered more clothes, skirts, blouses, even a pair of low heels. He spent hours watching makeup tutorials on YouTube, practicing with the few cosmetics he'd managed to scrounge up. By the time he had to leave for his next haul, Caden's head was spinning with new knowledge and possibilities. He packed his usual clothes for the trip, but tucked the corset into his bag as well, just in case. The long hours on the road gave Caden plenty of time to think. He found himself daydreaming about a life where he could dress as he wanted all the time, where he didn't have to hide this part of himself. It was during one of these daydreams, somewhere in the middle of Nebraska, that a name popped into Caden's head. Cynthia. He rolled it around in his mind, testing how it felt. Cynthia. It felt right somehow. For the rest of the trip, Caden, or Cynthia as he was beginning to think of himself, alternated between focusing on the road and imagining a future where Cynthia could exist full-time. By the time he returned home, Caden had made a decision. She was going to transition. It wouldn't be easy, and it would take time, but Cynthia knew it was what she needed to do. The next few months were a blur of doctor's appointments, therapy sessions, and gradually coming out to friends and family. Some were supportive, others less so. Cynthia lost some people she'd thought would always be in her life, but she also gained new friends who accepted her for who she truly was. Transitioning while working as a long-haul trucker presented its own unique challenges. Cynthia had to navigate hormone treatments around her irregular schedule, and finding time for electrolysis between trips was a constant juggling act. But every mile on the road, every state line she crossed, brought Cynthia closer to becoming her true self. She began to grow out her black hair, reveling in the way it softened her features. The corset that had started it all became a cherished possession, a reminder of the moment when everything changed. 1 year after that fateful night when she'd first put on the corset, Cynthia stood in front of her mirror once again. The person looking back at her was so different from the Caden of a year ago, yet somehow more familiar than ever. Her black hair now fell past her shoulders in soft waves. Subtle makeup enhanced her features, and the corset, now just one of many in her collection, shaped her figure beneath a flowing sundress. Cynthia smiled at her reflection, feeling a sense of peace she'd never known before. The journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges to face and obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in her life, Cynthia felt like she was truly herself. She picked up her keys, ready to head out for another long haul. But this time, she wouldn't be hiding. This time, Cynthia would face the open road as her authentic self, ready for whatever adventures lay ahead. As she climbed into the cab of her truck, Cynthia took a moment to appreciate how far she'd come. From that first nervous night in the diner to now, living openly as a woman, it had been a journey of self-discovery and courage. The engine roared to life, and Cynthia felt a familiar thrill. The open road had always called to her, but now it held new promise. Each mile would take her further into her new life, further from the person she'd pretended to be for so long. As the truck rolled out onto the highway, Cynthia caught sight of her reflection in the rearview mirror. She smiled, recognizing the woman looking back at her. It wasn't just about the physical changes, though those were significant. It was the confidence in her eyes, the set of her shoulders, the way she held herself. The corset that had started it all was packed safely in her bag, a talisman of sorts. Cynthia didn't need it to feel feminine anymore, but she liked having it with her. A reminder of how far she'd come, and the courage it had taken to take that first step. As the miles rolled by, Cynthia thought about all the changes in her life. She'd had to fight to keep her job. Some of her colleagues had been less than accepting at first, but she'd stood her ground, proving that she was still the same skilled driver she'd always been. Her family had been a mixed bag. Her parents were still struggling to understand, but they were trying. Her sister had become her biggest supporter, helping her navigate the complexities of women's fashion and standing up for her against anyone who dared to make a snide comment. And then there were the new friends she'd made in the trans community. Women who understood what she was going through, who could offer advice and support. Cynthia had never realized how lonely she'd been until she found people who truly got her. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Cynthia pulled into a truck stop for the night. She went through her evening routine, checking in, grabbing a quick dinner, and then retreating to her sleeper cab. Once inside, she allowed herself a small ritual. She changed out of her practical driving clothes and into a comfortable nightgown. Then, she took out her corset. She didn't wear it to sleep. That would be uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. But she liked to hold it for a moment, to remember. As she ran her fingers over the familiar fabric, Cynthia thought about the person she used to be. Caden had been so afraid, so unsure. He'd lived his life thinking that the discomfort he felt was just part of being alive. Now, as Cynthia, she understood that life could be so much more. Yes, there were still challenges. Yes, there were still people who didn't understand or accept her, but for the first time, she felt like she was living, not just existing. She carefully packed the corset away and settled into her bunk. Tomorrow would bring more miles, more challenges, more opportunities to be herself. Cynthia fell asleep with a smile on her face, excited for what the future might hold. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Cynthia woke early, as she always did on the road. She went through her morning routine with practiced efficiency: shower, makeup, hair. Each step felt like an affirmation of who she was. As she climbed back into the truck, Cynthia felt a familiar surge of excitement. The open road always held the promise of adventure, but now it felt even more potent. Every mile was a step further into her new life. She pulled out of the truck stop, merging smoothly onto the highway. The sun was just cresting the horizon, bathing everything in a golden glow. Cynthia felt a sense of possibility wash over her. Who knew what this day might bring? As she drove, Cynthia reflected on how much her life had changed in just a year. She thought about the first time she'd worn the corset, how terrified and exhilarated she'd felt. She thought about her first tentative steps out in public, that night at the diner when she'd been so sure everyone was staring at her. Now, she moved through the world with confidence. Sure, there were still moments of doubt, still times when she caught a glimpse of her old self in the mirror. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. Cynthia had learned to love herself, all parts of herself. She'd learned that femininity wasn't about conforming to some ideal, but about expressing herself in a way that felt authentic and true. As the miles rolled by, Cynthia felt a deep sense of contentment. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing what she loved, living as her true self. The road stretched out before her, full of promise and possibility. And Cynthia was ready for whatever came next. She was strong, she was resilient, and most importantly, she was herself. Fully and completely herself. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Cynthia smiled. She had a long journey ahead of her, both on this particular haul and in life. But for the first time, she felt truly equipped to handle whatever challenges came her way. She was Cynthia, and she was home in her own skin. The rest was just details.
Thanks for watching, my girlies. Be sure to check out Patreon for more.